right. Hey, everybody, it's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. Boy, have I got a special show for you today. We have Senator Phil Gramm is here. We're going to be talking about, well, everything economics, trade and tariffs and Trump and income inequality and poverty and the Great Recession, the Great Depression, you name it. I'm going to open, Phil, here before I introduce you with two quotes. You'll be familiar with these. The first is from Nobel laureate economist Friedrich Hayek. The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. Okay. And then the second one, you'll also know this.
25 years in government confirms that.
Yes, that's right. You have some experience in those matters.
Exactly.
I want to ask you about that. The second quote from John Maynard Keynes, which you'll also be quite familiar with. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. All right. Phil Gramm served 6 years in the U.S. House of Representatives and 18 years in the United States Senate, where he was chairman of the Banking Committee. Gramm is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He was vice chairman of UBS Investment Bank and is now vice chairman of Lone Star Funds in Texas. He taught economics at Texas A&M University and has published numerous articles and books, including The Myth of American Inequality, How Government Biases Policy Debate, co-authored with Robert Eklund and John Early, a Wall Street Journal Best Book of 2022 and winner of the 2024 Hayek Book Prize. His new book is, here it is, The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism, which he co-authored with Donald Boudreaux, who may or may not join us. We'll see. Welcome, Phil. How are you? Nice to see you. You're doing well. You're looking good.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be seen, Michael, and I appreciate you doing this show, and I appreciate you hyping the book because I want people to read it. I think the subject matter is important because it talks about why it is that we hold the opinions we hold, and it tries to provide in 5 historical examples and 2 current issues the information to debunk the myths that people often hold about these historical periods. And those myths affect their views on the role of government in a free society. And I see that my co-author, who has a hat on, has joined us.
Yes, I will give. Yes, so Donald, nice to see you.
I'm sorry, I had electronic problems.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. It's the curse of the modern world here, but at least we have this capacity to join you from wherever you are. I think you're in Washington, D.C. or somewhere back
Fairfax,
east.
Virginia.
Fairfax, Virginia. We're talking to Donald Boudreaux, who is the co-author of this book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. He is, let me give him a proper introduction here, an American economist, author, professor, and co-director of the program on American economy and globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Investors Daily, Business Daily, the Washington Times, and many scholarly publications. Donald, we were just talking about the kind of the overview of the book. But before we get into the details, let me ask, go back to you, Gramm, and then we'll bring you in, Don. What kind of science is economics? I mean, why is it that there's, liberal economists and conservative economists? There aren't liberal physicists and conservative physicists, although there may be, but that doesn't affect their physics or biologists or medical doctors. Why is it that I have to have a left-wing economist and a right-wing economist? Why can't I have a no-wing economist?
Well, there are too many with only a left wing. No, look, it's interesting because that's the subject of the book. The book is why, when you have access to information, the people who are reading the same facts reach different conclusions. And they do because they're looking at those facts through a lens that was grounded by their personal experience and by the view they hold as to how the world works. And let me just give you an example. Neither of my parents graduated from high school, and my brother was the first person in my immediate family to ever graduate from high school, first ever to go to college or graduate from college. And so, as a result of my life experience, if somebody is going to try to convince me of the argument of my uh, old colleague Bernie Sanders that the world is rigged, that you don't have a chance, they're going to get up mighty early in the morning, given my life's experience. And it's those kind of experiences and views of how the world works that really tends to determine, in the end, how people read history and how and what kind of views they have on public policy.
Mm.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please, Donald.
So it is true that economists do differ much more widely in their views of the way the economy works than do physicists of the way the physical world works. But that public perception is a little bit misleading. On many topics, most economists, regardless of where they fall on the political or ideological spectrum, we do agree on a lot of things. Most of us agree on that rent control has negative unintended consequences. Most of us agree with the same proposition on price controls. Most economists agree that tariffs and protectionism, for example, are counterproductive policies. So there is more agreement among economists than we often get credit for. But you are right. There is a wider range of disagreement than in the hard sciences.
I guess maybe part of the problem is some of these issues become politicized, and that's when one's political orientation kicks in, maybe. Phil, I think one response you would get out of Bernie would be, well, Phil, you just happen to be born smart and hardworking. You didn't choose that. I mean, you inherited that from your parents. It's largely genetic and so on. We're talking about, on average, somebody from your background is not going to fare as well as somebody who was born of parents in the top quintile or the top 1%. Just on average, those people are going to go to better schools, have more books in the home, have better quality diets and education and roads and all that stuff. So on average, we have to correct for those, I guess, bad luck circumstances that some people have. Of course, there's anecdotes like yourself that pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. But on average, we need to help those people who were born with bad luck.
I guess my response would be that, first of all, I failed the 3rd, 7th, and 9th grade. So
Oh, you did?
the degree to which I was really exceptional didn't come out very quickly. Secondly, I attribute most of my success not to being an extraordinary person. I'm an ordinary person in an extraordinary country where people have more opportunity, more freedom than any other people who've ever lived. Now, look, uh, I had a mother who loved me, and I had a very smart brother who was wise beyond his years, so I certainly was blessed.
Hmm.
And once I decided to get in the competition of life, I worked hard at it. But I think it is clear from all the evidence that I see that ordinary, average people in America who work hard, who make reasonably good decisions, can be very successful in this country. And never in my life has anybody said there was something I could be or couldn't be because of who my daddy
Mm.
was. It was always who I was, what I could do, what I could achieve. And I think that's true for everybody. So was I lucky? Was I blessed? Oh, tremendously. But nevertheless, the point being that with my life experience, you might convince me of a lot of things, but you're going to have trouble convincing me that America doesn't work. As I said, you're going to get up mighty early in the morning to make that argument stick.
Well, I think, and Don will bring you in here, that liberals accuse conservatives of embracing this just world theory, that is, a meritocracy works, and if you're rich, it's because you're hardworking and creative and risk taking, and if you're poor, you just didn't get up early enough or whatever. And then conservatives accuse liberals of embracing a unjust world theory, that is, America. Well, you know this from kind of I guess the recent turn of seeing America as a racist, bigoted hellhole, and in which some people are just born into these circumstances that they can never claw their way out of. Seems to me both of those are a little extreme. So how do you kind of address that? That natural inequalities in intelligence, creativity, work, personality, everything, just circumstances.
There's no doubt that luck and good fortune, both personal, the genes you're born with, the family you're born into, and just luck or bad luck that you encounter as you go through life, obviously plays a role in everyone's life. There's no getting around that. That's not capitalism or socialism, progressivism, libertarianism. That's just life. It's going to happen anywhere.
Yeah.
But but this should be kept in perspective. As society becomes wealthier, the range of opportunities expands. And while, as we document in the book, and we're not the only ones to do this, but we're among the latest. In the capitalist world, the floor has really risen for almost everyone. But not just the floor has risen, the ceiling has risen even higher. So you have a much larger range of possibilities. And when you look at that range of possibilities and you see the great differences, especially when measured in money income between the people at the top and the people in the middle, the people at the bottom, you say, oh my gosh, such inequality. But I think this should be kept in perspective. If you think about what John D. Rockefeller, who was still alive 100 years ago, what could he consume in 1925? He didn't have antibiotics. He couldn't consume the range of foods that we eat today. He may have had air conditioning in some of his mansions, but if he visited most restaurants or most of his friends' homes in the summer, they wouldn't have been air conditioned. He had his own private railroad car. He couldn't get in a chair and fly through the sky at jet speed. And so, in a way, I think in a very real way, consumption equality has greatly increased over the years. What has decreased. Consumption equality has increased. The decrease in our consumptionability has fallen. Monetary inequality has grown, but I don't put much stock in that. At least I don't put as much stock in monetary inequality as I do in our access to real goods and services. And I think that our access to real goods and services is far more equal today across all strata of American society than it has been in any time in the past. One other example: when we were all young, if you walked outside, say in the early 70s, you could tell a rich person's automobile from a poor person's automobile. They just looked different. They sounded different. They ran differently. Now, if you didn't know that a Tesla or a Lexus is a rich person's car and a Hyundai and a Chevrolet is a poorer person's car, you couldn't tell the difference. You walk outside, these cars are humming, they're shiny, they're not breaking down. So that's one small example of how just in our lifetimes, consumption equality has become greater.
Yeah.
Could I add one more
Please.
thing,
Sure.
Michael? Also, as we show in the book, another fallacy with Bernie's thinking is that the efforts that have been pushed by people who believe government is the answer to our problems have made the problem worse. The figures 50 years ago, if you look at income today and income 50 years ago, 66% of all people today have incomes that would put them in the top 20% in purchasing power as compared to 50 years ago. But the people in the bottom quintile are increasingly people that have had their incentives to get into the economy and to acquire skills diminished by efforts by government to, quote, take care of them. And the problem is I found in my 25 years in government, and it was very frustrating, was we never found a way to help people help themselves, help people without diminishing their incentive to help themselves. And many people who are not prospering in America, it's not that they're not prospering in the American economy, it's that they're largely not part of the American economy because they're not working. The labor force participation rate among the bottom 20% of American income recipients in the last 50 years, with the explosion of welfare spending, has fallen from 68% to 36%. And those are people who never get on the escalator, which is the American economy. So another problem with the thinking of the left is that programs don't, whereas opportunity and freedom do work.
Well,
If you
just
work,
punctuate
America works for you.
your first point would be that my dollars today, compared to, say, my father's in the 1950s and 60s, go a lot further. In other words, what percentage of my income do I have to spend for lights here and food and, clothing and stuff like that? My dollar goes a lot further than my father's. Is that your point?
And you got a lot more of them. And the quality of the things you're buying is higher.
Right.
I think a better way to put it, Michael, is your dollars might not go further because inflation has whittled away the value of each dollar.
Right.
What goes further is your income earning power, the amount of time that you have to work to earn enough income to buy a coffee maker, to buy an automobile, to buy a television, to buy a good set of clothing, to buy a sofa for your den. For almost all of those goods, the time required to work time necessary to acquire enough income to buy those things has fallen dramatically. There are some exceptions, and I think, not surprisingly, in my view, and I think Phil will agree with me, those exceptions are the three big ones are education, particularly my field, post-secondary education, healthcare, and housing. And these are all three sectors where there's really heavy government involvement. But if you look at, groceries, clothing, household appliances, even fuel, the energy, the time cost has dramatically fallen and steadily fallen for the past more than 50 years.
Yeah, I think sometimes these changes happen slow enough, maybe on the decadal level, that you don't quite see it in the daily, weekly, monthly reports and news stories and things like that. And it's only with reflection, so we need historians and economists to say, look at what it was like 50 years ago.
Yeah.
know, and, look at the house my dad lived in compared to mine, even though, he's middle class, I'm middle class. Mine's way better.
Yes.
It's interesting. I've got a little story, Michael. The gal who runs my office and much of my life just bought a new house. And she, of course, knows our book because she helped on every part of it. And so she said, I know we're better off, but it's so hard to make ends meet. And so I said to her, well, maybe the problem is the ends are so far apart. I said, how does your house that you just bought, her first house, how does it compare with your mother and father's first house? Her response, my house is nicer than any house they have ever lived in, including the house they live in now. And I tell you what really brings this home, and more people should do this. When I go back and visit the town I grew up in, I threw the newspaper in the richest part of town. I had 110 newspapers, and the part of town that was my paper route was where everybody would like to have lived.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are a few really nice old houses, but most of those houses, it seemed like mansions to me as a 12-year-old boy throwing a newspaper. Most of those houses I wouldn't live in.
Mm.
And it just simply shows you that we get things out of perspective in looking back on how things were then. I think it's easier for people who have not only lived a long time, but also have gone up the economic ladder a long way to see it. But it's true for everybody.
Mm. Well, I think the person you were talking to is maybe still listening, so I'd like to recommend giving her a raise. Okay, just kidding. I don't want to get involved in people's personal business. All right, Phil, you said something interesting there, that you failed as a senator in working in government for all those years to help people help themselves. What if the problem is that that's not what the government does? Because a lot of so here would be the argument that a lot of the things you're talking about come from the bottom up culture, religion, values, things like that come from family and books and education and so on. So here I'm thinking like really basic stuff like, graduate from high school, don't have children out of wedlock, get married, stay married, get a job. I mean, there's like 4 things. If you do these, you're not going to be poor. But how's the government going to make me get married? Or make sure I don't have children out of wedlock. That's not what it does, right? You're supposed to get
Well,
that from your parents or your culture, or your religion, or whatever.
well, I think government affects culture. I was once trying to explain to my mama that how fortunate we were that there was no welfare really when I was growing up. And her response was, "Well, what would that have had to do with us?"
Mm.
And my response was, "Well, mother, everybody you would have known would have been taking welfare. People would have laughed at you for not taking it. The
Mm.
government would have told you you're hurting your community by not taking the money in terms of economic development." And my mother's response was, of course, "I would never have taken it. And if you ever suggest to anybody that I would have taken it, I'll denounce you for it." But the point is, the system affects our values and in many ways can corrupt them.
Mm.
And one of the things that's clear when you look at what has happened to this group of people who are largely now operating outside the American economy, that when you add up the value of all transfer payments, they're so big, average for the bottom 20% of income recipients, about $65,000 a year now.
Wow.
They're so big that unless you've got a mandatory work requirement, if people don't have skills, there's really no incentive for them to work. And you
If I
can't get skills if you don't go to work.
if I recall,
And
Phil, weren't you in the Senate when Clinton passed the bill about from welfare to work, you have to get off the rolls and get back to work? Did that not work?
It worked, but it was for a very small part of the welfare system,
Mm.
aid to families with dependent children.
Mm.
But it really, and in fact, not only did the substantial number, this applied to women with children, not only did it, and this was signed by President Clinton, not only did it work that they got off the welfare rolls, but the great majority of them ended up going to work and being better off in the long term than they would have been had they stayed on that system. The problem is all the other programs exploded.
Mm.
And then various states got waivers of the work requirement. And then when President Obama came into office with the subprime crisis and recession, he waived it nationwide, the work requirement. So uh, I believe work requirements work. And I think when looking at reforming the system now, there are two reforms that would really have a big effect. Number one, make the Census Bureau count all these welfare payments as income. They don't even count a check you get as a refundable tax credit from the Treasury as income to people that get the check. Make them count that as income and base welfare on that measure of income, including things like debit cards for food stamps, and then have a mandatory work requirement. I think that would have a big effect. And then you're not cutting benefits for anybody. You're just simply get an accurate measure of income. And for people to get the benefits, they got to work.
Yeah. Donald, let me ask you this via this example. Would an example of libertarian paternalism or, choice architecture be the government gives me a tax break for being married? I have a kid, so I get a tax break for that. I get to deduct the interest on my home mortgage. So apparently the government wants me to own a home.
Yeah.
So these are, and I have an electric car, and I got a refund for that. So this is the government's way of kind of nudging me in the direction of doing what? I guess a more prosperous life.
Well, those are more than nudges. The true nudge is just to sort of change the choice architecture. But in these examples, you actually make out well or better financially by doing these things. So it's more than nudging.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on the tax code. Phil knows more about that than I do, but I believe that obviously the government needs revenue. Taxes are the way for the government to get revenue. In my ideal world, the tax rates would be low, the tax base would be broad, and there would be very, very few exemptions and exceptions, because otherwise special interest group politics plays in. You get distorted incentives as people try to move move to grab this particular exception and that particular exemption. Let me just say, can I say a word though about what
Yeah,
Phil?
please.
So I'll just throw this out, and your listeners can make of it what they will. The great Thomas Sowell, has done a lot of work on the history of Black families in America. And what he found is from after the Civil War until the 1960s, basically 100 years, the Black family was pretty stable. High marriage rates, there's not much in the way of out of wedlock births, at least compared to what was happening in other ethnic groups. And uh, so what we believe today to be the legacy of slavery is more like the legacy of the Great Society program, because for 100 years after slavery ended, for most of those years, the Black family was doing pretty well and progressing economically. And it's only with the advent of the Great Society programs that these happy trends took a downward turn. Now, you can say it's coincidental, both what happened after the Civil War and what happened after the Great Society program kicked in the mid 1960s. But the raw data, at least, are not friendly to the story that the plight of Black America today is a direct legacy of the horrors, and it was horrible, of chattel slavery that ended only in 1865.
Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
the same
Go ahead.
same thing is true if you look at the growth, at the number of uh, Americans that were poor from 1945 to 1965, it fell dramatically, some 50% decline in that relatively short period of time. But once the welfare program started, the progress basically ended.
Mm.
So again, uh, I think it's pretty clear that the war on poverty, well intentioned as it was a failure because it didn't deal with the problems of helping to make people more productive. It claimed that that was the objective, and it probably was the objective, but the programs didn't produce that result. And as a result, for 50 years, we've had virtually the same number a percentage of the population poor. A part of that's the way we measure it, but nevertheless, it's an indication that the program didn't work. And when it didn't work, what did we do? We spent more money on it. And when it didn't work, what did we do? We spent more money on it. We didn't reform it.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's a good place to go through your periods of time. And let's go backwards. So poverty and income inequality, and then the Great Recession, and we'll work our way back. Poverty, you're the first writers to make this point besides me when I made the point in an earlier book. Poverty doesn't need an explanation. That's what you get when you do nothing. It's the natural state of things. You know, for 99% of human history, if you go back a couple 100,000 years, everybody was poor, right? So I'll read you my little opening. This is from my book, The Mind of the Market. Living along the Orinoco River that borders Brazil and Venezuela are the Yanomamo people, hunter-gatherers whose average annual income has been estimated at the equivalent of about $100 per person per year. If you walk into a Yanomamo village and count up the stone tools, baskets, arrow points, arrow shafts, bows, cotton yarn, cotton and vine, hammocks, clay pots, assorted other tools, various medicinal remedies, pets, food products, articles of clothing, and the like, you'd end up with a figure of around 300. Before 10,000 years ago, this was the approximate material wealth of every village on the planet. And then I go, living along the Hudson River that borders New York and New Jersey are the Manhattan people, consumer traders whose average annual income is estimated at $40,000 per year. This all comes from Eric Beinhocker's book, The Origin of Wealth. And what was it? There was something like a SKUs, the SKUs, the number of different products is, I don't know, what, hundreds of millions or billions now, I think it is, compared to the 300 that the Yanomamo people have. So the question on the table is, how did that happen?
Well, let me, in responding, let me show you this chart. I don't know if you.
Okay, maybe I can find it. Let's see.
Well, this is a chart.
What page is that on? I'll find it.
The per capita income growth for the last 1,000 years.
Oh yeah.
What page?
I got it here. I got it. Yeah, I got it right there. Yeah. There it is.
Yeah.
No,
this is not working very well.
I'll put it up on the screen. Oh, here, this one.
Oh, there it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
Anyway,
the hockey stick. The other hockey stick.
What it shows is the following: that for 800 years, basically from the fall of Rome until about 1800, people pretty much lived like their grandparents did. People were poor, and wages went up when we had the Black Death, and it killed off substantial parts of the population. But the basic plight of all mankind was relative poverty. And then what happened is that you had first the Enlightenment, where the basic idea was born that people own their own labor. They own the fruits of their own savings. And suddenly, a productive force was unleashed that the world had never known. And the Industrial Revolution was the embodiment of it. And as Karl Marx said, the greatest critic of capitalism, but also a person who really understood what was happening, that in one short period of 100 years, that more progress had been made than all the other periods in world history combined. And what happened was capitalism. The idea that people own their own labor, they are the principal beneficiaries of it, not the crown, not the church, not the village, not the guild. And that unleashed the power and set about a process that has provided all of the riches we enjoy today. That's how it happened.
Yeah.
And the more we let those forces work in the world, the better off we're going to be, and the better off everybody is going to be.
Donald?
I think that's right, but I want to make two additional points that complement what Phil just said. One is fairly small. We talk about the title of the very famous book that is credited with creating modern economics. We call it The Wealth of Nations. I like the full title. The full title is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, which of course Adam Smith published in 1776. Adam Smith lived just at that time and just in that place where he noticed that ordinary people were, for the first time in human history, beginning to have sustained increases in their material standards of living. It hadn't happened before. It wasn't happening all over the place. And this is what sparked his curiosity. What's causing this wealth of nations? It would have been ludicrous for anyone in his day to ask what causes poverty. As you point out, poverty has no causes. You just pop out of the womb and do nothing, you'll be pretty poor. And I like the full title of the book that founded the profession in which Phil and I have made our living. The second point I want to add is in addition to the Enlightenment, or what happened along with the Enlightenment in many countries, particularly first in England and Scotland, and then to much greater extent in America, even greater extent in America, is the cultural acceptance of creative destruction. Entrepreneurs showing up on the scene, coming up with labor-saving technologies, new products on which people could spend their incomes. Whenever this happens, this churn in economic activity, some people are going to lose their jobs, some businesses are going to go bankrupt through no fault of their own other than innovation and changes in consumer tastes and opportunities. And a society has to be able to accept, even applaud creative destruction in order to encourage it. So I think it's a combination of the Enlightenment ethos along with the entrepreneurial courage, which itself was fueled by a social acceptance of creative destruction.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a great point. Why is it that we mostly hear about the plight of the poor workers during the Industrial Revolution? The Charles Dickens descriptions of these factories, the abuse of children, and 18 hours a day working, and only one day a week off, and so on. Why don't we hear about what those people were doing before they went and moved into these cities?
That's
what
exactly
were they doing?
right.
Well, weren't they toiling in agriculture, which is backbreaking work?
Yeah. And didn't pay as much.
Well, and living in huts with their farm animals. And that hut, if you're standing on the veranda of the manor house looking across the creek, look romantic. But I tell you, one reason we hear about it is opposition to creative destruction. We hear about it because all of those poems and novels were either written by or by the landed gentry or by people who they funded. And don't forget, the landed gentry was a loser in this. Their workers were leaving to go work in the city, and they were losing cheap labor. When the workers got to the cities and the parliament responding to the population change repealed the corn laws, government in Britain eliminated the tariffs that had been important to the wealth of the landowners. And so one of the reasons you hear all this stuff, and it's very moving. Oh God, that bread should be so dear and flesh and blood so cheap, was written about the very period that was the greatest period of advancement for working people in the history of the world, in terms of their income, in terms of how long they lived, in terms of their health, in terms of their education. The Industrial Revolution was a workers' revolution. Now, why don't we look at it that way? Because the Industrial Revolution made it thinkable that people didn't have to be poor, that most children didn't have to die before they were 5 years old, that society could do better. But we thought that way only because the Industrial Revolution had made it thinkable. So now we look back at life in London, where the population went from 1 million to 7 million in 100 years, and we say, my God, how terrible.
Mm.
But it's terrible compared to today, not compared to 1800. And
Mm.
that's an important thing to remember. So the Industrial Revolution is one of those 5 periods of history that in the book that we deal with in basically showing that we have a complete misconception of what is going on or what went on in the Industrial Revolution. And people writing about the period had a complete misconception as well.
Mhm.
When Charles Dickens wrote his famous book, Christmas Carol,
Mm.
in 1846, came out in December. That was a period where the curve in terms of well-being per capita income on a world basis had turned up sharply. But see, Charles Dickens conceived that the only way to help poor people was taking money away through charity, in his thinking, by having people like Scrooge give their money away. What he
Mhm.
didn't understand is that Scrooge, investing his money in the factories and the railroads, was doing more for mankind than he could have ever done by giving the money away.
Mhm.
And we have the
Yeah.
same phenomenon today with people like Warren Buffett. People talk about how rich he is, and is it fair for somebody to be that rich? But what's he doing with his wealth? Investing it in the future of America. He's done more good investing that money
Mm.
than the government will ever do when they take it and throw it away.
Mhm.
Or even if he gives it away to charity, it'll never have the effect that
Mhm.
it's had in terms of raising efficiency of the economy through investment. Look at our 401ks and IRAs, how they benefited from the basic system of investing on a value basis. So God bless you, Warren Buffett.
Now that he retired this week.
God
Yes.
bless you.
Yeah.
Well, one
You've
point,
made me
just
rich,
let me
richer by making yourself very rich, and I don't resent it. I don't resent it.
You don't, and I
Uh,
don't either. I don't care how much Elon makes. It doesn't hurt me. But there's a psychological effect here, a couple effects. I think one is the zero sum model of how the world works. And maybe before, I don't know, 500 years ago or so, anyone who did get rich, we know from grave goods, for example, a tiny elite lived very well, comparatively speaking, and 99% of everybody else was dirt poor. So maybe in the pre-industrial world, it really wasn't a fair system. It was rigged. People did have unfair advantages. So our natural psychologists assume it's a fixed pie because who understands graphs and charts and long-term trends? Nothing natural about that. So it feels like a fixed pie. And that guy over there has more than me, and he probably got it through some nefarious means. That's not irrational, right? The
well,
natural
it's
world, since post Adam Smith, that's unnatural compared to history.
Our
well.
world today is a Go ahead, Phil.
You go ahead.
So our world today, meaning the last 200 or 300 years, is in fact historically unique, and we're in a way we're the very unusual ones because we live in a positive sum society, in a positive sum economy. That was not the norm. When societies are bound by tradition, when so much energy is spent in war and conquest, the amount of wealth more or less is fixed. Maybe not absolutely over millennia, but it's very close to being fixed. And in that kind of world, it is true, as you say. When one person gets more, that necessarily reduces the amount available to other people. One of the great benefits of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism is that you get rich only by making other people richer. You make yourself more material prosperous only by finding ways to increase the material prosperity of your fellow human beings. And that builds on itself. And that's the world we live in today. But you're right if you're alluding to how our brains think, where we evolved in these little band and tribal units, and we look at the group over there, and they're trying to raid us. Well, we should raid them before they raid us, and if they get more than we do, it must be because they've taken it from us. So that zero sum mindset probably does go along. I'm sure goes a long way to explaining the mania for redistribution and the hostility to free markets.
Yeah. Also, the
Let me give
negativity.
you an let me
Oh, yeah,
give
go
you
ahead,
an
Phil. Yep.
yeah, Michael. In the Industrial Revolution in America, um, it created 4,600 millionaires. And a lot has been written about the Gilded Age
Mm.
and these rich people and all they had. But progressives focus so much on the 4,600 that they totally miss that 77 million people saw their income in America grow faster and their quality of life go up quicker than any other people who ever breathed the breath of life on this planet. And so you've got to look at the whole picture. Elon Musk is apparently quite rich, but did it, did he hurt me in making himself rich? I have his satellite on my house. I live out in the country. And
Nice.
that satellite made it possible for me to do this show. And so he's rich, but he made me richer by providing that satellite, which is about a third cheaper than I was paying a satellite company to provide service that wasn't half as good.
Hmm.
So, again, God bless you, Elon Musk. I don't know you, but you've done me a good turn, and I appreciate it. And you got rich doing it. Great. I hope there are thousands of Elon Musk out there ready to make my children and my grandchildren.
Well, they're doing it. I think the other effects I was going to say, the loss aversion, where losses hurt twice as much as as gains feel good. And then the negativity bias, where we notice negative things far more than positive things. You read through 100 comments on a post on social media, you'll notice the 2 or 3 negative ones and just kind of glaze over the 97 that were very positive. And our psychology is naturally attuned to that because there's far more ways for things to go bad than go good in life that can take you out. So our brains are designed to that. But I think it's hard to see that. And then you end up with, I'll read from Bernie here and tee this up for you on income inequality, our next subject, to focus on the 1%, right? So Bernie talks about, this is just from a recent speech he gave, our country is evolved into 2 Americas. In the first America, the uber wealthy buy $500 million yachts with helicopter pads, $270 million mansions with 30 bedrooms, private islands, a fleet of jets to take them all over the world, and rocket ships that blast off to the edge of outer space. They receive the best healthcare money can buy, send their kids to the best schools, and expect to live very long lives. And then, Elon, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, and so on. In the other America, the working class struggles just to provide for basic necessities of life. In this America, over 60% of our people live paycheck to paycheck. Millions work for starvation wages. 85 million are uninsured or underinsured. More than 20 million households spend over half their limited incomes on rent or mortgage, and over 60,000 die each year because they can't afford to go to a doctor on time. In this America, 25% of our seniors try to survive on less than $15,000 a year, and parents try to raise their kids in a nation that has the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. Because of the stress and inadequate health care, working people live far shorter lives than the rich. All right, there it is. Take it away,
All
gentlemen.
right,
What is
now
your
let me
response to
give you
Bernie?
whoa. Almost all that's wrong. Okay.
Okay.
When you count government transfer payments as income to the people that get those payments, the bottom 20% of American households have an average income of $65,000 a year. Almost no seniors are in that group. Um,
Hmm.
the
Interesting.
difference between my health care and Elon Musk's health care is almost zero.
Hmm.
Um, it is true that people have health problems, But much of it is not going to the doctor, not doing exercise, making a choice about being overweight. And this idea that there are people starving is just preposterous. Um, there are a small number of people who have fallen through the cracks in the system that you see living on the street, but they basically are people that have got a drug problem or an alcohol problem, and our welfare system is not reaching those people. And instead of just raising more money for food stamps, more money for this program and that program, we ought to be out trying to figure out what is their problem and how can we help them. But what we do is we point to those people in the street and say, look at the poor people, and let's raise food stamps, and they don't apply for the food stamps. So Americans are richer, freer, and happier today than any people in the world. And health care is available to everybody. There's no hospital. I'm 40 miles from San Antonio, but I go to San Antonio and I go to the best hospital in town and I walk in the emergency room and I say, I don't have a penny, but I need help. They're not going to throw you out. And you qualify for Medicaid if you'll sign your name on a piece of paper. And Medicaid is the best health insurance in the world in the sense that you don't have a copayment or a deductible. The problem with it is that government underpays the providers, so some providers won't accept it, but most will.
So you're saying Bernie's facts are not just wrongly interpreted, they're wrong.
Oh, they're wrong. They're flat wrong on all the figures.
Okay. Donald?
We, except for this very small group of people, as we have historically defined poor and deprived, there are no poor and deprived people in America, except the maybe 0.5% who have fallen through the cracks because of mental illness or drug abuse or alcoholism. And our program, while spending huge amounts of money, doesn't reach those people. And it's a terrible tragedy because they're people.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I agree with everything Phil says. I have nothing to add to it.
Well, let me ask you this, Donald. Once you set up a program like this, okay, we agree there's 0.5% to 1% that need help. And we have a moral obligation to help them. Maybe churches and stuff do some, but they don't do quite enough, so we need a government program. How do you stop it from growing into a monstrous bureaucracy?
Well, this is a big problem because once you create a government program,
that is the problem.
You create an interest group that has a vested interest in that program growing for the sake of growing and not for the sake of helping the people who it's designed to help. And the people who operate that program and who have the interest in keeping it going, they have an interest, as does Senator Sanders. They have an interest in overstating or exaggerating the problem, because if you can convince people that 60% of Americans are on the verge of starvation. Oh my gosh, I don't see any of them, but I'm happy to have my taxes raised. I don't want my fellow Americans starving in the street. Then you're more likely to get public support for the program. So that's a real problem. But it's a problem with any kind of government program, even ones created for the best purposes, most uncontroversial purposes. Once they're in place, there's a natural political incentive for them to metastasize into something larger than they should be.
And then you've got a political constituency of the people that work in those programs. And finally, most government services turn into institutions that are run for the benefit of the people that run the institutions and not for the benefit of the people they're supposed to be helping. And that's the biggest problem with public education, is that people are moving to school choice, A, because the test scores show it works, and B, because increasingly it's clear that the system is designed to benefit the teachers and the administrators and not the students. And people now realize it, and that's why they're changing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, right. On terms of income inequality, I was thinking about relative positions and H.L. Mencken's wisecrack. A wealthy man is one who earns $100 a year more than his wife's sister's husband. So even if the poor are getting richer, the rich are getting richer faster, and it feels like positionally I'm falling further behind, even if absolutely I'm better off than my parents or grandparents.
Well,
So
let me respond first, and I know Don wants to respond. You saw the article in the Wall Street Journal about 14 people,
Yes.
14 people
Right.
that have these incredible incomes,
Yeah.
and how unequal that is. Point is, those 14 people earned that money, and they made everybody else better off in earning it. Uh, uh, this idea that somehow I'm worse off because somebody else is better off than me is a very un-American idea. I think one of the things that affected me when I was throwing my newspaper, and all of my clients I thought were rich. Well, I paid attention to them. How were they different than we were?
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I observed quickly is they worked harder than we did.
Hmm.
And secondly, they had sharper tools. They were educated. And so uh, I think what we need to do is figure out, some of the people that are mega rich, like Musk, obviously they're smart, smarter than we are. And so it's unlikely that I could ever, under any circumstances, do what he's done. But I don't need to do what he's done. The point is, there's plenty I can do. There's plenty everybody can do if they apply themselves and if they make reasonably good decisions.
Mm.
If you're poor in America, it means you made a lot of bad decisions over and over and over again.
Mm.
It's hard to fail, at least in
Donald.
the world we grew up in.
As I
Donald.
said, as I said earlier, I believe that the visible differences between the rich and the poor are actually shrinking. I
Mm.
imagine if you walked down Fifth Avenue 100 years ago, you saw a rich person, you saw a millionaire. That person stood out as a millionaire. You walk down Fifth Avenue today, and you pass a hedge fund manager who's worth several $1 million. He looks or she looks just like you do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's curious that the people who most most warn about the dangers of envy and jealousy. Oh, the poor or the relatively poor are going to revolt because even if they're getting richer in an absolute sense, the rich are getting richer even faster. These are the people who keep blaring about how the income differences are growing. If you really believe that this is a source of revolution, you want to keep that quiet rather than blast it out because it's just not that visible. I remember when Thomas Piketty published his famous book in
Mm-hmm.
2014. Paul Krugman, I think it was in a New York Times column, Paul Krugman said, "Boy, I'm paraphrasing now. Oh, it's wonderful that Piketty now published this book because we all know that these income inequalities, it's great and it's huge and it creates social revolution, but no one really knew how big it was until Thomas Piketty published his book." Well, well, if you got to write an 800-page book or 900-page book in order to inform people that income inequality is a problem, I wonder how much of a problem it is. You just don't see it.
Right.
We read about it, intellectuals bemoan it, but it's just not that visible in our everyday lives.
The
Well, and
phone
if
that
you read,
the phone that
if you,
Elon must have is no better than mine.
yeah, exactly. And if you read Piketty's book and he's looking at inequality, he doesn't count any government program
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
income to low income people, even though 88% of the income to America's poor comes from the government. And then on the upper end, he doesn't count taxes. So people that are paying over 40% of their income in taxes, he's assuming they get to keep it. And then finally, to add the ultimate bias, he's not using income as we define it.
Hmm.
He's using income that the income you would have if you sold every asset you own every year and paid taxes on it. You know, when the ProPublica expose came out, they had the stolen tax returns. It didn't make sense to me, and we looked at it. And what turned out to be the case is they apparently took the amount of taxes the household paid, but they didn't take their taxable income to make the comparison. In Buffett's case, it was what his income would be if he sold everything he earned that year, owned that year, and paid taxes on it. So imagine what your income would be if you sold your house, your car, and all your retirement program and had to pay taxes on it. You'd look pretty rich. But is that comparison in any way meaningful? No. And what difference does it make if the top 1,000th of a percent of the population is mega rich? It makes no sense to me. What makes sense to me is, can I achieve goals? Can my children and grandchildren get ahead based on their own merit, their own ability, their own? And the answer in America is yes. George Washington's grandmother came to America as an indentured servant. He became the richest man in North America, President of the United States, and King George III called him the greatest man in the world. And that kind of opportunity is still available in America.
I love that
And that's
line
what
from
our
your book.
books.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just great. Yeah, I have a friend that works at one of the biggest venture capital companies in Silicon Valley. So I asked him to give me a back of the envelope calculation, like how many people do you hear pitches from and how many do you fund and so on. Roughly speaking, for every 100 pitches they hear, they fund one to the tune of many millions of dollars so they could really get their company going. And then of the 100 they fund, maybe one becomes a massive IPO that pays off in terms of billions of dollars. You know, this is the survivor bias. You know, the bureaucrats, socialists, and so on. They have to wait for the capitalist and entrepreneur system to pick out the one guy that made it, right? And then say, look at that, Elon and Bezos and so on. What about the other that you know that maybe they went out of business or they're barely struggling, and how come we don't pay attention to those guys?
Yeah.
Jeff
And
Bezos,
do we rescue them when they fail?
Jeff Bezos wasn't guaranteed to succeed by any means when he started selling books online back in the 1990s or late 1980s, whenever it was. It turns out he survived, no doubt, a combination of some luck, but also of great skill and fortitude. He didn't take, and as Phil keeps saying, none of that wealth was taken from anyone. All that wealth is a representation of what he's created for everyone.
Yeah.
And so in my view, in a capitalist entrepreneurial market economy, the higher your profits, that is a recognition of the magnitude by which you've helped your fellow human beings. So the more you have, the more you've helped me and others. So as Phil says, more power to you.
Yeah. All right, let's talk tariffs. Here's from Adam Smith talking about the growing of grapes in France. Smith noted is cheaper and more efficient than in the colder climes of his homeland, Scotland. For example, by means of glasses, hotbeds, and hot walls, very good grapes can be raised in Scotland, but at a price 30 times greater than in France. Quote, would it be a reasonable law to prohibit the importation of all foreign wines merely to encourage the making of claret and Burgundy in Scotland? Smith answered the question by invoking a deeper principle. What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better buy it of them. Okay, so what do I care that I get all my electronics from China? So how does this hurt me?
The point is, why would you buy something? Why would you produce something yourself when you can buy it from somebody else cheaper.
Yeah.
And this idea that people that I buy from have got to buy from me. I've shopped at the same Walmart for 23 years, and I've spent, I would guess, over $100,000 there in 23 years. They've never bought anything from me, nothing.
You're
And
getting
so you
ripped
could
off,
say, my
Phil.
God,
They're
look,
ripping
I'm
you
being
off.
ripped off. I'm being ripped off by Walmart. But I still go there. I'm going to Walmart tomorrow and buy groceries. Why? Because they're cheap and they're good, and I'm better off doing it. So this whole notion that what I buy from somebody, they've got to buy that amount from me, or that nations uh, have got to have sell the same amount of goods and value that they buy. Uh, None of that stuff makes any sense.
Just
Basically,
on a technical question, where does the money go from tariffs to the Treasury Department?
So
if they're collected, the
if they're collected,
problem is the
Oh,
president is trying to say, well, with tariffs, we'll keep foreign goods out, and therefore we'll bring back the cotton mills. Will people quit investing in AI and invest in rebuilding cotton mills? And then our children will leave college and work in the cotton mills uh, uh, without basically coming to any understanding of why the cotton mill shut down to begin with, because it didn't make sense for us to make textiles, and people didn't want to work in textile mills. My mother spent 20 years eliminating 2 jobs in the cotton mill in our
mm.
hometown, my job and my brother's job.
to your question, Michael, the tariffs can be distinguished. There are two types: of revenue tariffs, and those are designed to bring in revenue, and the designers of them want those tariffs to keep out as few goods as possible. A protective tariff is exactly the opposite.
Mm.
It will raise revenue as an incidental matter, and that goes to the Treasury, but that's not its goal. The goal of a protective tariff is to keep imports out, and imports that are kept out are imports on which tax revenues are not collected. And so it's distressing to hear the administration simultaneously brag about how much revenue their tariffs will raise, but that they can only do so if a lot of imports come in, and at the same time brag about how many imports the tariffs will keep out, which will diminish the amount of revenue the tariffs
Yeah.
raise. Indicates to me a lack of clear thought, rational thought, if you will,
Hmm.
about the effects and purposes of tariffs. Let me give you one other Adam Smith quote. You didn't read it. It's not one of his most famous, but it's one of my preferred Adam Smith quotations. He's got a lot of them. Nothing, however, can be more absurd than this whole doctrine of the balance of trade. And so we have trade policy today driven by fears over the U.S. trade deficit. The folly of doing that was recognized in 1776 by Adam Smith. Most economists ever since then have recognized the folly of worrying about trade deficits. But today we have tariffs being imposed on the false premise that trade deficits are a national emergency that have to be addressed through protective tariffs. And it makes no sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember
Well,
this it
and
happened
I'll
with.
give you an
Oh, yeah.
example.
Please go ahead, Phil.
In the 29 years after World War II, when we had a monopoly in manufacturing and we had trade surpluses, the economy grew on a per capita basis at 2.1%. In the next 29 years, when we had trade deficits, it grew at 2.2%.
Mm.
So there's no evidence that there's a correlation between trade deficits and lagging growth. In fact, in the whole 19th century, we ran deficits almost all the time because foreigners were investing money here. And in doing that, they ended up driving up the price, or in the process, those capital surpluses created the trade deficit as people, as that money was then spent buying capital goods to come into the country. So there's no evidence to suggest that trade deficits hurt growth.
Quite the
In
opposite.
fact, some of the fastest growing periods in American history, including the Trump administration in 2017, 18, and 19, before the pandemic.
Mm.
In those years, the trade deficit went up. Why?
Mm.
Because the reduction in tax rates and the deregulation attracted foreign capital to come in the country. And in coming in the country, it drove up the value of the dollars. They bought dollars to invest in America. And that made imported goods cheaper. Americans bought more.
Yeah.
So were we poor? No, we were richer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's back to that zero sum thinking. They're ripping us off. Who's the us? Certainly not the consumers. So my favorite example of this, when I was in my early 20s, I had a Honda 175 motorcycle. Now, why didn't I buy a Harley Davidson? Because they were a lot more expensive and not as good, right?
Yeah.
And then I liked Ronald Reagan, but then he passes this tariff, raised the tariff from 4.4% to 49.4% for a single year, taxing all the Hondas, Yamahas, and Kawasaki motorcycles and Suzuki to help bail out the Harley Davidson motorcycle company, right? So he was, always the hero. He bailed out this American company.
Yeah, but let me
but
tell you, I
American
was
consumers
there,
then have
so
to
I
pay
wanna
more
tell you
money.
the rest of the story. The
Yeah,
rest
please.
of the story was that Congress had just bailed out Chrysler. There was a building clamor in Congress to impose protective tariffs. And so Reagan took action on executive authority aimed at preventing those tariffs from coming into effect. Reagan hated protection.
Okay. All right. That's
Uh,
interesting. I didn't know that.
and
Very good.
and if you look at the period from Franklin Roosevelt to President Trump, during that period, we had little things done where we did a voluntary restraint on auto imports as the Americans were ending their monopoly and having to start really focusing on making quality automobiles. Those actions were really aimed at preventing tariffs. The first president, 13 presidents, who basically believed that trade expansion was good for America.
Mm.
Not until President Trump took office did someone impose a tariff on the basis of their belief that tariffs were good and trade was bad.
All right, gentlemen, let's talk about the Great Recession. Phil, you yourself are blamed in part for this, as you know, because you write about this as part of the myth that the Great Recession was caused by deregulation of the financial markets and greed, and that your own actions in Congress helped bring this about. That's the myth. What's the truth?
Well, I was number two. Alan Greenspan
Yeah,
he caused the recession, and
right.
I was the number one helper in the process. Well, the truth is that the legislation that we had passed prior to the Great Recession for 25 years, there had, for all practical purposes, been no real deregulation. Graham Leach Bliley did allow banks to engage in insurance and security trading, but it regulated each of them separately, and it made the bank hold additional capital. And none of those areas were deregulated. What happened in the Great Recession was that there was a push by the federal government that really started in earnest under President Clinton to promote home ownership by pressuring Freddie and Fannie, the two housing guarantee loan agencies, to lower credit standards. And by the time the wheels came off, 50% of the new loans that were being made were subprime. And when housing prices stopped rising and people could no longer get second liens, all these people that had bought these houses but were unable to make the payments started to default. And because government had promoted housing, it had given a premium to banks that held mortgage-backed securities as capital by treating them as good as treasuries. And as a result, the collapse in mortgage-backed securities brought down the whole financial system of the world. So what caused the crisis was not deregulation, but a government policy to make it easier to buy a house by destroying credit standards. And so the regulator had safety and soundness requirements that had not changed, but they had a new requirement to promote home ownership. And when they had to choose between the two conflicting requirements, they went with the new requirement. And as a result, we had this disastrous banking collapse. But there's no evidence that had we had 10 times as many regulators and had they had more power, that they would have done anything. And President Clinton has been clear spokesman against the idea that Gramm-Leach-Bliley deregulated anything or that deregulation had anything to do with the subprime crisis. Now, everybody can have his opinion, but they don't get to have their own facts. And so what we do in the chapter, as we do in all the chapters, is we present simple facts. And then we present what we think is a myth. And we give it full description and full accounting of all the facts it cites. And then we set about to debunk the myth. And I think in this chapter, we clearly debunk the myth.
Yeah. So what I talked about earlier, like the government nudging me to be a homeowner by giving me a break on my, I could deduct the interest on the mortgage, but there's people that can't even get started. They can't even get the home in the first place. So by the 90s, the emphasis is for the government to say, well, we want to help people become homeowners, so we're going to lower the standards that it takes to get that first home, that very first home loan. Your income doesn't have to be as high as we required before, and you don't have to have as much credit as required before, something like that. So for good intentions. And then I think about, does it come down to just individual loan officers? You know, you're just sitting there across from somebody. This is before they did it all online. And you fill out the forms and they're like, yeah, okay, I'll approve this. Then I imagine the salespeople that are pushing these loans, you know, they have quotas they got to meet. So their boss says, you know, how many mortgages did you close today? Well, I got 10. Well, you know, Jake down the hall got 15. So come on. And then, you know, I just sort of imagine that, you know, the system kind of gets hacked a little bit by just the way the overall structure is set up to allow that. It's not greed so much as that's the incentive. It's just write more mortgages. And then
Well, yeah, but
let me make one point on that narrow point, Don. We now know, and we cite in the chapter, the internal memos of Freddie and Fannie, where their people are saying these loans are very dangerous. And they knew that there were problems, but they were being pressured. Don't forget, Congress set a target that if they didn't meet, they were concerned that the Congress would intervene in their business. And those targets were that a certain percentage of their loans be the kind of loans you're talking about, where people will loan money that didn't have a down payment, that didn't have a stable job, and that clearly we're going to have trouble making the payments. And that's what happened. They knew it. We've got the documentation in the chapter where we've got the internal memos that have since been made public, where they say that this is we're creating a crisis here. But they kept right on doing it because Congress was pressuring them to do it. And
That
that's really what happened.
And that
Yeah.
cascaded down the system. To your point, Michael, if you're a banker, obviously you want to make as many loans as possible, but you don't want to make bad loans because
Yeah.
yeah, right. And so what happened is with Fannie and Freddie being forced by Congress to back more of these shady loans, not very stable loans, that made it easier for banks to say, well, okay, I can sell it to Fannie and Freddie. So sure, I'm not going to pay as much attention to the credit quality of this particular applicant. If Fannie and Freddie weren't doing that, it would be in the bank's own interest to have paid more attention to each applicant's creditworthiness. And so it came from the top, as it does so
Yeah.
often. It was a cancer from the top that spread on down that encouraged these really bad loans that crashed the system.
And the people that took the loans out, they're also incentivized because the housing market continues to go up, even better than the stock market for a while there.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
right.
it's like, why not?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they could get a second loan.
Yes.
They could
Right.
get a second lien on the house and take that money out and spend it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing was a bomb waiting to go off. And when it did go off, because government had in setting capital standards for banks, set mortgage-backed securities as equivalent to treasury bonds, banks held huge amounts of it. The bank that I worked for at the time, UBS, the big Swiss bank, held $50 billion of mortgage-backed securities.
Oh.
So they went from the best capitalized bank in the world to a bank that was never in danger of collapsing, but that had very real problems overnight.
Do you think the system could have held on years longer had the housing market just continued to go up? Or did these, loans come due and they just simply were not able to pay them?
I
Not sure I got the question.
Oh, well, let's say in 06, 07, well, I guess late 07 and into 08 is when the housing market started to flatten out. What if it hadn't? Here, the analogy is like Bernie Madoff's pyramid scheme. What if the stock market had just continued to go up and Bernie was able to pay off all his customers? He could have kept going for years. It's only because things.
It could have, and it could have been worse.
The longer it would have gone on, the worse it would have been.
Yeah, so the collapse would have been worse.
Timing of it, it didn't have to happen in
What about these like derivatives and credit default swaps and all those? Did that diffuse the responsibility of the risk?
No, and in fact, the credit default swaps market never folded. It allowed institutions to try to protect themselves, but the argument that they were a cause of the problem, I think, is invalid. They were an instrument that people that in banks were using to try to protect themselves, but they didn't cause the problem. Would be my argument.
Okay. I thought Greenspan, didn't he say he thought derivatives were a bad idea or changed his mind about those?
No.
Or am I? No, okay.
He didn't think they were a bad idea. In fact, Greenspan gets very bad treatment by history here. He was the only official in the government. I was out of government by then. But he was the only official in the government who said that Freddie and Fannie were in a dangerous position and cautioned the Congress and the executive branch about going further in promoting making these housing laws.
Hmm.
So I view him as more the hero than the villain
Really?
here.
Okay. And what about TARP? Did we need to have the bailouts?
I think TARP was very successful. It didn't necessarily look like it at the time, but looking back, the only loans that weren't ultimately paid off were General Motors, and that was about a problem that had nothing to do with the housing market.
Hmm.
So I think that it helped. I think you've got to give the Treasury high marks for it. Much, and they did a much better job than was done during the S&L crisis, where the government actually lost money.
Hmm. Right. Don, do you think you often hear this on the left? No one paid a price. All those top guys, those CEOs, they just kept making money. Goldman Sachs and all that, and no one had to pay the price for the disaster. And the average American, never recovered because they didn't have a stock portfolio that went back up in the ensuing years.
Well, sort of my memory of the period was that the CEOs and key leadership of most of the big banks ended up getting fired.
Hmm.
Uh, Now, was it their fault? I would say no, but when you're the top people and there's a failure, it's your fault. You take the blame.
Yeah.
Uh, and if you look back at the people who were heading these big institutions, including the one I worked for at the time, they all got fired.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think of it when this was unfolding. There was all the scandals about doping and cycling, which is my sport, and I know all the players and so on. And it was evident that it had been going on for a long time, and long enough that even the people that did the cyclists that didn't want to dope, they had to because this is what everybody else was doing. And it was just kind of built into the. I did sort of a game theory model of how this works. That if you think if everybody else is doing whatever in the system, then that's the way the system is set up. It's the system, not the players, that are really responsible for when bad things happen. Something like that.
Well, I mean, I
Well,
think the system here was the problem. And the system ultimately traces back to Congress's and the administration's
Right.
attempt to artificially increase the rate of home ownership by having the government purchase mortgage-backed securities that really were not as as safe as they were sold as being.
Yeah.
And that
Okay.
did spread throughout the whole
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you-
requiring them to buy them,
Yeah, yeah,
not giving them a
yeah,
choice. They had to do it. They had a quota that a
yeah,
right.
certain percentage of the loans they purchased had to be subprime.
yeah.
But do you think there needs to be some regulation of the financial markets, or for that matter, more broadly, free market
Yeah,
capitalism needs some rules and regulations?
I think safety and soundness regulations are critical in a fractional reserve banking system. The problem is that the argument was made that deregulation caused the crisis, which allowed the same government that had promoted the housing policy to expand its control over the banking system without reforming Freddie and Fannie.
Hmm.
Now,
Right.
Freddie and Fannie cut back on their loans and to stop making subprime loans, but they're making them again now.
Hmm.
Not
Yeah.
many, but they are.
Hmm.
So the housing market needed reforming, but we reformed the banking system to give the government a tremendous amount of control over the financial markets of the country.
Hmm.
So the argument was made that deregulation caused the problem instead of subprime lending, and that allowed government to take greater control of banks without ever having to reform the housing system.
Hmm.
That's what happened.
Nice.
Uh, and it's an unhappy history of the period, but it's
Yeah.
a period that is greatly misunderstood, and obviously, I think our chapter does a good job at
Oh,
explaining.
I thought you did a great job on that. Yeah. Gentlemen, we're coming up on 90 minutes here, but I don't want to let you go without a couple of big picture questions. In terms of like the role of government in interacting with markets, do you think we need some government for collective action problems like the electrification of the rural South in the 1930s, the interstate highway system in the 1950s, the moonshot, the internet, and so on? Is there, kind of a blend there, a right percentage of government nudging and funding to get infant industry started?
Uh, well, not to get infant industry started, but I think if an industry has a good promise, uh, financial market operatives have incentive to channel finances to that because financial markets are forward looking. But reasonable people can and do disagree over the exact extent to which government is necessary for infrastructure and funding research and development. I think these are interesting arguments and they're legitimate arguments. But we are so far now with our regulatory and tax policy beyond where the reasonable arguments are. And we just have this maze of unfortunate regulations, unfortunate restrictions, unfortunate tax policies that I believe any reasonable person, if they look at it, they can say, okay, that should be trimmed back. And when we trim that back or down far enough, then we can have interesting debates about, all right, how much should the government fund R&D, or how much more of a road system should the government build? Um, uh, I'll let Phil chime in.
Well, let me give you my cut at it. Obviously, we need regulation to enforce the laws against fraud. Uh, we need government to regulate the banks in terms of meeting capital requirements. Um, I think where we get into problems is where politicians think they know more than markets do,
Mm,
where they decide that it's in America's interest that 4,300 sugar producers be rich and that all Americans should pay twice as much for sugar as the world market price is.
mm,
Uh, that's the policy of this country today.
mhm.
I think we get into trouble where, President Biden makes a decision that we ought to have all this investment in making computer chips, and the most successful computer chip maker in the world, who, with these subsidies, is investing huge amounts of money in the United States, says that he thinks that the chips we make here will only be 50% more expensive than the chips he's making in Taiwan. Now, what is going to happen when all those chips come off and we can't use those chips to make things in America that are competitive on the world market? Well, you don't have to have much of imagination to know that then government will say, well, we need to protect the American chip industry.
Yep.
And so then we got we don't let foreign chips in. We use chips that are 50% more expensive. And then we can't even sell the products we produce here.
Mm,
And so then we got to have all these tariffs. The problem is government doesn't know what the market wants or what it's going to want and need in the future, and that the great bulk of those decisions need to be made by the marketplace.
mhm.
Um, and did we benefit by speeding up the electrification of the South? I think you can make an argument for that. Uh, but it's so easy there to go beyond.
Mm,
Um, and did the Tennessee Valley Authority ultimately turn out to be a good investment? I think that's a much harder argument.
Yeah, the
Interesting.
electrification wasn't picking winners or losers.
Yeah.
And so much of what government does now is in the vein of picking winners and losers.
Yeah. Okay. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, fad or the future of money?
So you're not going to like my answer. I have just chosen as a matter of course. I don't give much headspace to cryptocurrencies. I got so much other things to think about.
Yeah.
I rely on my colleague Larry White, who is one of the great monetary and banking theorists. He thinks that there's a lot of promise in cryptocurrencies. I can't vouch for it. I trust Larry White's judgment, but I just don't know.
Okay.
Well, let me say this. I can't see the value proposition in investing in cryptocurrencies, and I wouldn't do it.
But I don't do it, so that maybe it says something.
Yeah. Me neither.
Yeah.
Okay. How about
But see, it's a free country. Here's the deal.
yeah.
If people think there is a value proposition, they can invest in it. And if they lose their shirt, it's their problem.
Yeah.
The government shouldn't come in and bail them out if they lose money. But I
Right.
got no objection to people doing it. I wouldn't do it because I don't understand the value proposition. And I think it's not going to end well, but that's just my opinion.
Okay. Modern monetary theory. We could just print all the money we want because we're the United States government, and then we could give everybody a universal basic income (UBI). Give me your thoughts on those two.
I mean, this is just a magical
Well,
thing. It's crazy talk. The ultimate economic problem is that real resources are scarce: land, human labor, iron ore, capital goods. Money might not be scarce. The government can print out as much as it wants, but that doesn't create real resources. Modern monetary theory is ultimately based on the fallacy that every time you print a dollar bill or whatever currency you're talking about, you somehow print the resources or create the resources that back that dollar bill. And that's just not true. It's just, I don't know a better, here's my scientific term for modern monetary theory: wackadoodle.
Wackadoodle.
well, I would add to that first of all, it's hard for me to believe the advocates of it really believe it.
Mm,
It almost sounds like this is a fancy name for just get the hell out of my way and give me what I want.
Yes.
But I think you could argue, and during the Biden administration, we put it to the test. We spent more in 3 years than we ever spent in two. And we printed money at a faster rate than any other year in the post-war America. And what happened? 40 year, we had virtually no inflation for 40 years, and suddenly, bam. So it doesn't make sense. It's been put to the test. It failed. So I laughed at it to begin with, and I'm still laughing. But unfortunately, we still practice it because it's good politics for some.
mm.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you guys are Phil, you're a conservative, and Don, you're a libertarian. What's the future of the conservative party with Trump and MAGA? They're not really conservatives in the kind of fiscal sense. They're protectionists or whatever, populists. What are your thoughts? Are you encouraged or discouraged?
Well,
Or what are you? Yeah.
first of all, um, I think many of the policies, protectionism, I think their antitrust policy now is becoming very questionable. It's not very different than the Lena Khan policy of the Biden administration, which is alarming to me. And it shows a willingness to subsidize things that the president or somebody in the administration thinks they know more about than the 360 million people who make decisions as economic decision makers in the country. So I think they're right about extending most of the existing tax code. I think the not taxing tips or not taxing my Social Security and giving subsidies for people who borrow money to buy American cars. I think those are all bad ideas
Mm.
and they shouldn't occur. Uh, and I think their deregulation policy is good, but I think many of their policies are not the kind of policies that I supported.
Mhm.
And I don't have any problem saying I voted for Trump 3 times.
Mm.
I want him to be successful. I have attacked the trade policy because it's going to fail and it's going to hurt the country and it's going to hurt our workers and it's going to be devastating for the Republican Party unless they come to their senses and find a way out of this mess. But I'm a Reagan Republican, and I haven't changed my opinion on those subjects. And I'm against protectionism. I'm against using antitrust policy for anything other than protecting consumers.
Mm.
And I don't like government deciding what is invested in.
Mm. Right.
I want markets to decide that because if people are wrong, they pay for it. If government's wrong, I pay for it,
Nice.
which is a big difference.
Donald?
I'll add only, I agree largely with everything Phil said, but I will add only that what's just one thing that's especially distressing to me now is how supine Congress is.
Mm.
Regardless of your preferred substance of policy, what policies you like or dislike substantively, it's distressing that Congress is so out of the picture now. Everything or so much is being done by executive order. It looks like an imperial presidency. I think this is very dangerous, no matter who is in the White House, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Socialist. This is not the American way. This is certainly not what the framers of the Constitution at all had in mind. And so that's one process change that I would like to see addressed.
Yeah. All right, last question. One of my favorite books is Trekonomics, about post-scarcity economics. Let's project ourselves maybe 200 years into the future. Are we on the road with AI and everything, technology progress and moral progress, where everybody has enough? Like everybody lives the equivalent of the 1% today in a century from now.
Yeah, I'm afraid that we're going to have to wait till we get to heaven to escape.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
As my administrative assistant says, it's so hard to make ends meet.
Hmm.
It's hard to make ends meet because they grow and they grow and they grow and they
Oh,
grow
right,
as we
right.
get more prosperous. Until we get to heaven, we're going to have to make decisions of what we want. And I don't want government to make those decisions. They don't know what I want. They don't know what I need. They don't know what my children need. They don't know what you need. They have a political agenda. Most Americans have a agenda that they want to live a good life. They want their children to live better than they do. And that's the kind of person I want to make the decision. I don't want the decision to be made in Washington, D.C. I was there for 25 years. I saw the process, and it doesn't work very well. When you're spending somebody else's money, you don't spend it with the same attention you do when you're spending your money. And so it behooves us all to limit the power of government and limit how much money it has.
Mm. Donald?
I'll add only that all talk that I hear of post-scarcity, it just sounds ridiculous to me. It's not going to happen. I mean, we're mortal creatures. We live in physical space. We have a limited amount of time. As long as those realities remain, then we will always be in a world of scarcity. One of the great benefits of markets is that it pushes the boundaries of scarcity out. Things do become more abundant, but they are always scarce, and there will always be trade-offs. It is simply unavoidable in this veil of ours.
Yeah. Yep, as Thomas Sowell said, there are no there are no solutions. They're just
There's only
trade-offs.
trade-offs. Yep.
That's right.
Yep.
That's the world we live in. All right, gentlemen, again, here it is, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. It's a great book. It's really one of the best economics books I've ever read, and I've read
Thank
a
you.
lot of them. Really good, really important. Let's get it out there. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, please read it. We don't mind you buying it. It's good.
That's right.
But it's more important that you read it because
right.
our prosperity and our freedom depend on knowing the truth to make you free. But you got to learn. You've got to seek out the facts first, and that's what we do.
The truth shall set you free. That's right. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you,
gentlemen.
Michael. It was great.